The hidden reason why 90% of Tibet is empty. A steel gate shudders, inches open, and a wall of glacial water surges into a narrow gorge of the Yarlung Tsangpo. Downstream turbines whine. Up on the plateau, the wind carries nothing, no engines, no crowds, just thin air over miles of empty land. 90% of Tibet sits unpeopled, and it's not only because breathing hurts here, it's useful. Rivers that feed billions start in this silence. Borders harden along a high, thin frontier. One relocation order turned a roaming life into a street address. To see why this emptiness became strategy and why it keeps working, we have to start with how the plateau was born. The plateau that shouldn't exist, geological trap. To understand the politics, we need the rock. Around 50 million years ago, the Indian tectonic plate slammed into Eurasia and kept pushing. That collision didn't just raise mountains, it hoisted an entire region into the sky. The Tibetan Plateau is a superplateau, 2.5 million square kilometers, averaging over 4,000 meters in elevation. An uplift so extreme it bends climate, rivers, and lives. The crust here thickened like bread dough under pressure, stacking slices of rock into towering ranges. Himalaya to the south, Kunlun and Kilian to the north, Karakoram to the west. The result is not just tall, it's high everywhere. At that altitude, physics sets the rules. Oxygen drops to roughly 60% of sea level. Bodies move slower, thinking gets fuzzy, pregnancies risk complications. Long-term residents adapt with larger lung capacity and higher hemoglobin, but newcomers pay a steep acclimatization tax. Sunlight slices through thin air with potent UV. Winters arrive early, summers are brief, and soil stays cold. Permafrost underlies huge swathes, locking moisture out of reach and turning the ground into a seasonal trap. Rock-hard in winter, waterlogged and unstable when thawed. That alone throttles dense settlement. Farming needs a predictable growing season, but here, frost can bite in any month. Barley, potatoes, and hardy buckwheat survive in pockets, yet the plateau doesn't hand out surplus easily. Livestock do better, yaks, sheep, and goats roam for forage, but herding spreads people thin by design. Too many hooves in one place and the grass fails. So mobility becomes the safety net. Move with the seasons, share pasture risk, and survive the lean years. Meanwhile, the place that looks like a desert stores water like a vault. Snowfields and glaciers bank monsoon bounty, then melt it out through the dry months. This is the water tower of Asia. The Indus, Sutlej, Brahmaputra, Salween, Mekong, Yangtze, and Yellow all catch their first breath here. But there's a paradox. When the summer monsoon climbs the Himalaya, it spills rain on the southern slopes, then wrings itself out. The plateau interior often stays stark and cold-dry, while its edges cradle the moisture. That asymmetry means some valleys carry green, while open plains stay brown. Livable pockets prove the point. Lhasa and its basin sit lower than the high ridges, shielded from blasts of Arctic air and the full brunt of monsoon storms. River terraces along the Kirchu offer enough heat and water for fields, and south-facing slopes nurse small microclimates. Elsewhere, rain shadows behind big ranges lean into calmer skies and manageable wind. These are the nodes where towns took root, centuries before asphalt arrived, where pilgrims, traders, and monks could make a living on barley, butter, and exchange. The plateau's hazards never clock out. The same collision that built it keeps shaking it. Faults creep and sometimes jump, earthquakes that shiver stone houses and crack roads. Steep slopes and loose moraines feed landslides that can dam rivers in minutes and burst without warning. As glaciers retreat, lakes dammed by fragile ice and rock swell in their basins. A warm week, a heavy rain, or slope failure can trigger a glacial lake outburst flood, an icy wall that roars down a valley, silt-choked and fast. Villagers learn to read the water's color, to listen for the change in its voice. Permafrost adds a quiet menace. It anchors the ground until it doesn't. Warming pushes the freeze line deeper into retreat, and what used to be solid slumps into thaw. Roads buckle, embankments leak heat, rails need insulation, and buildings demand special foundations. Every kilometer costs more, every repair is a negotiation with ground that's literally changing state. Even where permafrost is patchy, the unpredictability raises the price of permanence. Settling widely across this terrain isn't just hard, it's expensive to maintain forever. Add wind. At 4,000 to 5,000 meters, air is thin and fast. Dust lifts easily, scours fields, and strips moisture. Farmers plant windbreaks where they can, but trees grow slowly in cold soils. Add UV that cracks paint and ages skin. Add a diurnal swing that can flip from sunburn to frostbite in a day. All of it stacks up into a math that punishes sprawl and rewards shelter, valley bottoms, tucked villages, walls that face the right way, and towns where services can concentrate. And yet scarcity shapes power. Land that can feed people exists, but it's threaded like beads along rivers and in basins. Whoever holds those corridors, passes, bridges, junctions, can move goods and enforce rules. Trade routes along the Yarlung Tsangpo, the Brahmaputra's Tibetan name, carried salt, wool, and stories because they were the only reliable channels. Later, roads and rails would follow the same logic. The plateau doesn't invite a carpet of villages, it invites choke points. That physical map set the limits. It explained why most of the plateau stayed open and quiet, why people moved seasonally rather than settle everywhere, and why the densest places huddled where water, heat, and shelter overlapped. But it also created an opportunity. If a government wanted to control this region without blanketing it with people, the land had already drawn the diagram. Focus on the nodes, watch the passes, keep the open spaces clear and observable. The land set the boundaries. Policy would soon carve them deeper. Frontier by policy, from empire edges to PRC incorporation. While the land drew narrow corridors, empires learned to use them. Under the Qing, Tibet sat as a high buffer more than a governed heartland. Imperial strategy treated distance as insulation. Ambans in Lhasa watched politics, monasteries managed daily life, and caravans threaded the passes. As long as tribute moved and the frontier didn't spark a crisis, loose control worked. The plateau's emptiness helped. It dulled invasion routes and slowed revolt. Control meant influence, not saturation. Then the 20th century tugged the edges. British expeditions pushed up from India, trade on paper, leverage in practice. The 1904 Young Husband Mission forced treaties that opened markets and strained the old buffer logic. Later, the similar negotiations sketched the McMahon Line in the east, a boundary Lhasa accepted on its side, but Beijing never recognized. Maps hardened where geography was still the real border. Out on the ground, lines were a rumor. A ridge, a pass, a village that moved with seasons. Those set the rhythm more than ink. Between world wars and civil war in China, authority fractured. Lhasa asserted autonomy, minted its own currency, and navigated between neighbors. Britain faded. Newly independent India inherited anxieties and treaties. For a while, the plateau's distance looked like protection again. But a state rising in the east saw vulnerability instead. For the People's Republic, declared in 1949, those highlands were a frontier to secure, not a buffer to tolerate. The logic flipped. Emptiness needed a plan. In 1951, the 17-point agreement announced Tibet's peaceful liberation and promised autonomy within the PRC. The People's Liberation Army entered not as a raid, but as an administrative project. The first moves mirrored the terrain, gripped the nodes. Garrisons and offices went up in Lhasa and Shigatse, airstrips were carved where valleys allowed, roads stitched across passes the way caravans once did. The pattern wasn't a swarm, it was a net. Towns became knots, the open land stayed open, but watched. Those early roads mattered as much as flags. The Sichuan, Tibet and Qinghai, Tibet highways clawed across permafrost and scree, hauling diesel, cement, and carders into places that had never seen a motor. Each bridge changed local economies. Caravans lost their edge. Grain and uniforms moved faster than rumor. Surveillance could travel. The state didn't need to fill the plateau to change it. It only needed corridors strong enough to move decisions uphill and resources downhill. Population strategy followed that infrastructure logic. Secure hubs first. Encourage workers, traders, and administrators into the towns. Keep the grasslands thin. Mobility that once protected herds now looked like evasion to government, mapping taxes, schools, and rules. Sedentarization would come later. At first, checkpoints and registries did the work. The emptiness beyond the highways wasn't a failure to populate, it was a choice to concentrate. There was pushback. In 1959, after tensions over reforms, taxes, and fears for the Dalai Lama's safety erupted in Lhasa, an uprising met force. The diaspora began. Monasteries, the engines of education and social life, came under tighter control. The state deepened its hold on the nodes and widened the gaps between them. In the 1960s, upheaval swept all of China. and the plateau's networks took another turn toward command. When the country later opened and reformed, those corridors stayed. New asphalt, same geometry. Here's the quiet contradiction. The PRC's core doctrine prized development and population growth, yet in Tibet, much of the land remained deliberately empty. Why preserve emptiness if numbers mean strength? Because in a place where altitude, distance, and water define leverage, emptiness can serve power. Fewer people in the hinterland make movement easier to monitor. Fewer villages near borders reduce friction during standoffs. Fewer settlements along rivers simplify dam sites, transmission lines, and resettlement plans. Meanwhile, legitimacy required building. Investment flowed to the hubs, hospitals in Lhasa, campuses, housing blocks, new markets. Subsidies sweetened life where oxygen thins. Migration policy added layers, encouraging cadres and technical workers to rotate through while pushing herders to settle for services. The plateau's economy shifted toward nodes by design. The empty spaces didn't disappear. They receded behind checkpoints and policy goals. External borders pulled on this strategy. Undefined lines in the west and east with India, a long seam with Nepal and Bhutan, each demanded roads, depots, and airfields at altitude. Emptiness near those edges became a buffer no insurance company could price. If a crisis flared, there were fewer civilians at risk, fewer evacuations, fewer hostages to escalation. Troops could maneuver on roads meant for both freight and force. The landscape amplified that logic. High passes are narrow, valleys funnel movement. Control them, and you don't need to occupy the plains. But the pivotal lever sat in the riverbeds. The same corridors that carried subsidies could carry turbines. Upstream of nations downstream, dams promised power and timing control. To use that leverage, the state needed securable headwaters more than sprawling towns. Emptiness helps keep a grip on headwaters. Patrols see farther. Projects face fewer local vetoes. A sparse map is easier to redraw. This was the moment policy met terrain and chose the same lines. The empire had buffered by absence. The modern state buffered by corridors. Emptiness didn't vanish, it was curated. And because the plateau's rivers reach far beyond its borders, that curation wasn't only domestic. It set the stage for upstream advantage. Emptiness, leveraged through water, height, and distance, would become a quiet instrument of power. The water tower of Asia, headwaters as leverage. Follow the rivers and you follow power. Up here, 7 great systems pick up their first threads. The Indus and its Sutlej arm to the west. The Brahmaputra born as the Yarlung Tsangpo, slicing east before it U-turns into India. The Salween and Mekong dropping through gorges toward Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. The Yangtze and Yellow turning China's heartland green and then brown with silt. They don't just pass through the plateau, they're made by it. What this means upstream is simple. Timing decides fortunes. A dam gate opened a week earlier can shave the top off a flood downstream. A gate held closed can store the pulse for when grids need megawatts at dusk or fields need a steadier trickle in April. None of this changes how much water falls from the sky over a year, but it does change when it arrives and at what speed. In places where farmers set planting by river height or fishers time nets by dry season flow, that calendar is everything. On the Yarlung Tsangpo, the Zangmo hydropower station anchored the first cascade on the Tibetan side, part of a ladder of dams including Gyatso, Gyacha, and Jiksu. These are run-of-river plants, which means they generally don't hold back years of water, but their reservoirs can still shift daily and weekly rhythms. Downstream in India, after the river becomes the Siang and then the Brahmaputra, small changes in shoulder season flow can tilt power generation plans and irrigation schedules. After the Brahmaputra slows into the Assam plains, silt is a blessing and a burden. Timing alters how much is spread and where it settles. Eastward, the Mekong offers a clearer lesson. Its headwaters rise in Tibetan ranges before cutting south into Yunnan and then through mainland Southeast Asia. China's upstream dams, Xirao, Nujiadu, and others, have been shown to buffer floods and also intensify dry season low flows when reservoirs store water for power. Communities on the Tonle Sap, the lake that famously reverses flow with the Mekong's pulse, feel those shifts in fish catches and planting patterns. When the upstream calendar slides, boats come back lighter and markets reflect it. Upstream advantage isn't just concrete, it's information. Gauges high on the plateau see floods early. Data shared or withheld becomes leverage. Between China and downstream countries, there are memoranda of understanding for flood season data sharing, but no basin-wide binding treaties along the lines of the Indus Waters Treaty. On the Brahmaputra, India and China exchange hydrological data at certain stations during monsoon months. On the Mekong, China is not a full member of the Mekong River Commission, but provides data through the Lancang-Mekong Cooperation Framework. Those arrangements help, but they're patchwork. They leave room for suspicion when flows don't match expectation. For states downstream, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, the stakes are concrete and human. Pakistan's canals feed from the Indus, whose snowmelt signature starts in Tibetan and Karakoram ice. India's northeast knows the Brahmaputra as both lifeline and threat. A swollen monsoon brings fertile silt and sudden ruin. Bangladesh lives inside a delta that breathes with seasonal pulses. The right kind of flood is life. The wrong timing is disaster. Lower Mekong villages set their year by a river that used to be more predictable than the price of rice. When timing shifts, costs show up not only on hydrographs, but in calories, cash, and migration. Inside China, the story is twin-headed. The Yangtze's upper reaches rise in the plateau's cold, and its flow supports hydropower giants downstream. The Yellow River's sediment, much of it loess, some from plateau headwaters, has always complicated management. More storage upstream can modulate flow, but can't erase 1,000 years of silt. For Beijing, upstream control is national security wrapped as development. Power for factories, water for cities, and flood control for megadeltas where tens of millions live. There's the unbuilt spectre too, diversions. Proposals have circulated for years about transferring Brahmaputra headwaters north or east toward drier basins. The grandest schemes would punch tunnels through rock that makes engineers sweat. None of those mega-diversions exist in practice on the Yarlung Tsangpo, and official messaging emphasizes hydropower, not interbasin transfer. Still, the idea shapes anxieties. If upstream can time water, could it someday reroute it? Even rumors move politics. Zoom back to the cascade logic. In narrow gorges, the most efficient plants sit close together. Each dam flattens turbulence for the next, squeezing more electricity from the same drop in elevation. But cumulative effects ripple downstream. Peaking operations can send daily surges. Sediment gets trapped, starving floodplains of nutrients. Fish migration routes shrink unless ladders or bypasses actually work at this scale. In the Mekong Basin, studies have tied upstream peaking to unusual low flows in recent drought years, even as official releases cited limited storage. On the Brahmaputra, India's planned dams in Arunachal Pradesh are framed as counterweights, catch what China modulates, add flexibility on the Indian side. Meanwhile, climate change is reshuffling the deck. Glaciers are retreating, snowlines are rising, and permafrost is thawing. In the near term, meltwater boosts flow, a deceptive bonus. Later, as ice stocks shrink, dry season base flow could fall. For upstream planners, that argues for more storage to smooth volatility. For downstream farmers, it argues for transparency and rules so that a thinner glacier century doesn't also mean a thinner harvest. All of this loops back to emptiness. To hold the water, you need to hold the heights and the rails to reach them. Fewer settlements along headwaters simplify land acquisition, resettlement, and security. Patrols can watch valleys where the only movement is scheduled. Maintenance crews can reach gates without weaving through village politics. The plateau's open spaces, which once kept people moving, now keep projects manageable. Control of timing, backed by concrete and corridors, turns geography into quiet power. Steel over sky, railways, roads, and controlled corridors. Steel had to learn to breathe thin air. When planners drew the Qinghai-Tibet Railway from Xining to Lhasa, they weren't just laying track, they were solving altitude. Engines lose power where oxygen thins, so locomotives came with turbocharging tuned for 5,000 meters. Passenger cars got pumped with supplemental oxygen. Under the rails, permafrost wanted to heave and slump, so engineers lifted the track on embankments, slid thermosiphons into the ground to wick heat upward, and spread crushed rock to vent the cold.